Good morning. I'm Pamela McCall. Thank you for joining me from 10 to noon here on CFAX 1070. This is where the show now goes to pot, though. Kirk Tousaw is the lawyer representing Owen Smith and the executive director of Beyond Prohibition Foundation. Good morning, Kirk, and thanks for joining me.
It's my pleasure, Pamela.
Kirk, the head baker of the Cannabis Buyers Club of Canada is to be acquitted of 2 outstanding drug offenses. Take us back a bit, the history. What is this ruling?
Well, this ruling follows on the heels of an earlier decision last year in which the Supreme Court of British Columbia determined that the Health Canada's medical marijuana access regulations were unconstitutional, arbitrary, and too restrictive. The regulations prevent patients who have a license and prescription to possess and produce marijuana for medical purposes. It prevented them from having the medicine in any form other than the dried bud itself. Now, what many people and your listeners may not understand about marijuana is that the medicinal components of marijuana are largely contained in little resin glands that are attached to the plant matter, but not inside the plant matter itself. And so the medicine is actually in these resin glands or trichomes. And we argued that patients ought to be free to extract the medicine from the plant and then use those medicinal compounds to make cookies or to consume in tea or to make lotions or those kinds of things in order to be able to ingest the medicine in a way other than smoking it. And because the government's regulatory scheme didn't allow that, we said the scheme was arbitrary and unconstitutional, and therefore my client, Mr. Smith, was performing a pretty valuable service in providing these non-smoked forms of the medicine for people to obtain at the Cannabis Buyers Club of Canada. The judge agreed with us, struck the word dried out of the marijuana medical access regulations, but because Mr. Smith was engaged in activity which was nominally unlawful at the time he was engaged in it, we had to proceed to a trial. And so we set up a jury trial that was supposed to begin in February. We were going to argue the issue of medical necessity to the jury and say even though what he did was technically illegal, he was motivated by the need to do so to serve these patients who were finding a great deal of relief from the products. And we fully expected the jury to acquit Mr. Smith. My understanding is the Crown, given the judge's ruling, didn't feel that they could secure a conviction in front of the jury. And therefore, on Thursday, they're going to be calling no evidence in the trial. And of course, if there's no evidence, then Mr. Smith will be acquitted and found not guilty by the judge.
Let's go back a bit here. What is the problem between dried marijuana and having it in tea or baking it in brownies? Why was that even contested?
Well, I mean, that's a question better put to Health Canada, but it did certainly argue that the regulatory scheme was fine, that patients were adequately serviced by being able to possess the marijuana in its bud or dried marijuana form, and that there was no need for the ability to make these other kinds of medicines out of the dried marijuana. I mean, to the point where it was, we had a patient who liked to make tea out of marijuana, and she just ground up the bud and put it in a little tea filter, and then put it in the hot water and the cream, let it soak, and took the tea filter out as you do when you make tea. And the judge really found it hard to believe that it was perfectly legal for her to grind up her marijuana bud, to put it into her tea, but the minute she took the plant matter out of the liquid solution, she'd created a marijuana extract, and that suddenly became illegal, even though everybody conceded that the actual medicinal compounds were in these little resin glands that sort of come off into the tea when she's making it. It doesn't make a lot of sense, obviously, to me and to Mr. Smith, nor to the patients. And so that was one of the bases for the challenge.
I find it interesting, too, how Owen Smith was arrested. Describe what happened when the police obtained his search warrant and what they recovered.
Well, apparently there was a complaint about smell from the apartment that he was using, and the Cannabis Buyers Club of Canada had made some efforts to try to secure a commercial kitchen to do the baking in, but were unsuccessful largely because landlords didn't want to rent to an activity that could be considered unlawful. And so they were making cookies and oils and other baked goods and non-baked goods and lotions and those kinds of things in this apartment. And so there was a complaint about smell. Police executed a search warrant, found Mr. Smith there doing his job, making these medicinal compounds and different substances for the clientele of the Cannabis Buyers Club of Canada, and arrested him for it and charged him with production and possession of marijuana for the purpose of trafficking.
But once again, your prediction in the court case later this week.
Well, he'll certainly be acquitted. I mean, the Crown has advised that they're not going to call any evidence, and when there's no evidence against someone, then they must be acquitted because there's no evidence upon which to make a finding of guilt beyond a reasonable doubt.
What does this mean for everybody else in terms of precedents?
Well, at this juncture, in British Columbia at least, patients, those persons who have an authorization to possess dried marijuana, are entitled to possess marijuana in its non-dried forms. They're entitled to possess the resin. They're entitled to possess baked goods and those things. Health Canada has not responded in any way to sort of amend the regulatory scheme to deal with things like the weights that people will be allowed to possess, because obviously cookies weigh more than plant matter, and you run into some problems there. But patients in British Columbia can possess marijuana in formats other than just the bud format. Unfortunately, at least at this juncture, producers, those people who have licenses to grow cannabis for medical purposes, they're still not allowed to then turn that product into the baked goods before sending it to the patients. Health Canada, the federal Crown, argued in court that the judge's declaration of unconstitutionality should be suspended for a year to allow the government to respond, and in part it was the part that applied to these cannabis producers. But at least patients in British Columbia have, for the last several months, been able to consume their medicine in a variety of non-smoked formats, which is great. And I imagine we're going to be off to the Court of Appeal because I think the federal Crown is going to be challenging the judge's ruling on the constitutionality of the scheme.
It gets pretty complex, Kirk. And I know I believe you've studied law down in the U.S. as well, so I'd like to talk a bit about Washington State when we come back from our break. We've been talking to Kirk Tousaw. He's the lawyer representing Owen Smith, the head baker of the Cannabis Buyers Club of Canada. We look forward to being back with you just after a short break. Good morning. I'm Pamela McCall. Thank you for joining me from 10 to noon here on CFAX 1070. We are talking about marijuana, to bake or not to bake. Essentially, Kirk Tousaw is the lawyer representing Owen Smith and the executive director of Beyond Prohibition Foundation. Kirk, of course, the head baker of the Cannabis Buyers Club of Canada, is to be acquitted of 2 outstanding drug offenses. So we've talked about the machinations of what's going on legally in Canada about how medical marijuana can be served or consumed. You have studied law down in the States. How does this stack up compared to what's just gone down in Washington State in terms of legalization of marijuana? Does it fly in the face in a big way in terms of the opening of the floodgates down there?
Well, certainly Canada continues to lag behind the United States in its cannabis policies. At one time, we thankfully lagged behind the United States in ramping up the war on drugs. We've unfortunately caught up to and even surpassed them in some respects with Prime Minister Harper's mandatory minimum sentencing for even minor marijuana and other drug offenses. But now that the United States seems to be on a trend towards outright legalization, taxation, and regulation of both medical and non-medical cannabis, we're again finding ourselves behind the times and really behind public opinion on this issue. I mean, it's clear that voters in this country are fed up with the waste of money associated with marijuana prohibition, its ineffectiveness at curbing use, demand, or supply, and its continuing infringement on basic civil liberties. And so, unfortunately, it doesn't look like the government of Canada is at any time soon going to take a rational and common sense approach to the issue of marijuana in our country, tax it, regulate it like any other commodity, allow adults to consume it for medical and non-medical purposes without government interference.
Kirk, we have a caller on the line. Pete's with us from the Gulf Islands, rather. Good morning, Pete. Your question for Kirk.
Hi, I am on a disability and I get great relief from marijuana, but I'm surrounded by medical marijuana growers, and I can't afford to get my certificate to obtain marijuana so I can smoke it legally. And all these medical marijuana growers I live around are nothing but drug dealers. They don't sell to anybody that I know of that needs it for medical purposes. So to me, it's just a ticket for these folks to make their mortgages and not work. Where I live now is a complete drug economy, and it's getting dangerous. So now I'm moving. It's that bad, right? Somebody should address the fact that these guys are basically just drug dealers. Nobody's watching them.
Whereabouts are you moving to?
I'm moving to Victoria.
Okay. And Kirk, your reaction to Pete's sentiments, his frustrations?
Well, I certainly understand the frustration with the marijuana and medical marijuana system in this country. I mean, we have to remember that even the medical marijuana system is simply an exception to an overall system of prohibition. It's been demonstrated from the history of humanity, really, but certainly over the last 20 years here in British Columbia, the prohibition of marijuana is an outright failure, that all it does is create huge cash incentives in the illegal drug economies, and that funnels money into places where we as citizens may not want it to go. Now, I'm not sure that Pete necessarily has all the facts about his neighbors. Maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong. I certainly can't comment. I certainly can't comment on that. But I would say that any of these problems exist solely and only because of our system of prohibition. If we treated marijuana like we do other commodities, both alcohol, tobacco, and things that are much less dangerous and tobacco like marijuana is, we wouldn't have any of these problems, and none of this would be in the black market at all. It would all be in an above ground, tax regulated commercial framework. So, there's no doubt that any system of prohibition is going to have problems, and it's going to create problems. And certainly we need to be moving away from it as quickly as possible to avoid the things that Pete's talking about.
How does the case of Owen Smith, dubbed the head baker of the Cannabis Buyers Club of Canada, how does this underscore the whole system that's been set up in Canada and the bureaucracy compared to what's going on in the States? Is it simply just a procedural nightmare now?
Well, it's just another example of the unconstitutionality and the overly restrictive nature of Canada's medical marijuana program. This program was instituted in 2001. It's been declared unconstitutional by courts of provinces right across the country many times since then, at least twice here in British Columbia. I've obtained decisions finding the system unduly restrictive and a violation of the charter rights of patients. And the government seems intent upon refusing to fix it in a manner that's really going to work for patients and for the general public. And so it's a continuation of this sort of mindset that marijuana needs to be kept out of people's hands, even people who benefit medically from consuming it in its various formats, rather than a mindset that acknowledges, look, people are going to consume marijuana for medical purposes, for non-medical purposes, for spiritual purposes, and for any purpose they choose to do so. We're not going to prevent that by using the criminal law. And so what we need to deal with as a society is, okay, look, the criminal law is not the right tool to deal with this conduct. We've seen that. We understand that. So what is the right tool? And in my submission, the right tool is a taxed and regulated approach that treats marijuana like any other commodity, with restrictions on access that are appropriate to the potential risks that its use carries. And those are relatively minor.
Why do we seem to be so far from that becoming a reality? I mean, it used to be Washington State, very tough laws, very tough at the border. Obviously, taxation dollars were a big motivation. Why do we seem to be so far from going down that path?
Well, the biggest obstacle to sensible cannabis policy reform in this country is the conservative government that's currently in power in Ottawa. I mean, Mr. Harper is got an ideological blind spot on this issue. And it's, the irony is that the marijuana prohibition is hardly a conservative, if you understand that political sort of philosophy properly. It's hardly a conservative position. I mean, marijuana prohibition is an economic failure, an economic nightmare, really. It's also a giant nanny state, government in the private lives of citizens issue, which is typically not what conservatives view the role of government to be. So, I don't quite understand how marijuana prohibition is reconciled with conservative political philosophy. But the biggest obstacle to sensible cannabis policy reform in this country is the Conservative Party of Canada. The Liberal Party of Canada is in favor of legalization currently. The New Democratic Party of Canada is in favor of legalization. The Green Party is in favor of legalization. Even in Quebec, they're in favor of legalization. So the only real political obstacles are those thrown up by Mr. Harper, and unfortunately, he's taken this country in exactly the wrong direction, pursuing a failed and proven failure policy of mandatory minimum sentencing for even very minor drug offenses.
Kirk, you are the executive director of Beyond Prohibition Foundation. I guess by virtue of heading that up, you must believe at some point that this is going to change, and what I'm hearing is it's going to have to mean a change in government.
Well, because all criminal law, and that includes drug policy, is controlled at the federal level, I think we are going to require a change in government in order to see meaningful reform, unless it occurs through the courts, and that's certainly a possibility. Or there are some steps that the provinces can take. I'm also part of an organization called Sensible BC, and your listeners can find it at cannabisdigest.ca. That's working on a provincial initiative to be filed late this year for a vote in 2014. The goal of which is to essentially amend the Provincial Police Act to decriminalize simple possession of marijuana by adults. And our basic thrust is to say, look, the taxpayers of British Columbia are sick and tired of spending millions of dollars enforcing a failed criminal prohibition, and we certainly shouldn't be penalizing adult citizens for possessing small amounts of marijuana. So we're by initiative going to instruct the police not to spend our money, and it is our money after all, enforcing the law preventing simple possession of marijuana by adults.
So you'd be running an end game around the federal government?
Well, I wouldn't call it an end game. I would say that the province is entitled to determine how it spends its limited policing resources. And I think that most citizens agree that we shouldn't be wasting our valuable and limited tax dollars going after people with small amounts of marijuana when there's so much other more serious crime going on in this country and in this province.
So you think it's just a matter of time before that idea just gathers pace and the people taking to the streets to bring that about?
Well, I certainly hope so. And Pamela, the public's way ahead of the government on this issue. I mean, a majority of citizens in Canada support legalizing, taxing, and regulating cannabis. It's just a matter of getting the politicians on board. And, we've seen tremendous amount of progress in the New Democratic Party and now in the Liberal Party of Canada towards adopting that as their official party platform. So if we can get a change of government in Ottawa in 2015, then hopefully we can see some meaningful cannabis policy reform, and we can stop spending our tax money to create black markets that only profit those who wish to operate outside the law.
Meanwhile, back at the courthouse, Owen Smith, the head baker of the Cannabis Buyers Club, once again, your predicted outcome of his court appearance this week.
Well, he'll be found not guilty on Thursday, and then the Crown will be will have 30 days to determine whether or not it's going to appeal the constitutional ruling.
And you think that appeal is likely?
I think it's a virtual certainty.
Right. So on we go. The ramifications of letting this go through without appeal are simply too big for this government to handle.
I guess so, and it's probably worth mentioning that part of the cost of prohibition that we, the taxpayers, are paying are the costs of paying Crown Counsel and police officers and judges and court staff to sit and hear these constitutional challenges, which I've got at least 4 coming up this year, and all will require significant amounts of court time. And I think that court time and those resources are better spent dealing with things like child custody issues, civil suits, and the things that ordinary Canadians would like to see the courts dealing with, not prosecuting people for making marijuana cookies for critically and chronically ill Canadians.
Well, given your busy court dates, I'm sure we'll be speaking to you again. Kirk Tousaw is the lawyer representing Owen Smith and the executive director of Beyond Prohibition Foundation. Thank you so much for your time today and for your insight.
It's been my pleasure.
All the best.